The Alaskan wilderness has always been a place of mystery and myth, where nature reigns supreme and the silence is broken only by the wind and the occasional animal call. I moved here years ago, searching for peace and solitude away from the bustle of city life. But what I found was nothing short of terrifying. At first, everything was perfect. The air was crisp, the land unspoiled. I built my cabin on a hill that overlooked a vast expanse of forest and mountains. It felt like I had found my sanctuary, far from the noise and chaos of the world. But that peace was shattered one fateful night. It began with strange sounds. At first, I thought it was just the wind howling through the trees. But as the nights went on, the sounds became more distinct. Twigs snapping, footsteps crunching in the snow, a faint whisper carried on the breeze. There was no one for miles around, so who or what could it be? I tried to ignore it at first, thinking my mind was playing tricks on me. But then, I started noticing things out of place. My equipment, tools, and supplies would be moved or missing. I'd find my front door wide open in the morning, even though I was sure I had locked it the night before. Something, or someone was out there watching me. One evening, the situation escalated. I was sitting by the fire when I heard a loud bang against my cabin door. My heart raced, and I grabbed the rifle I kept by the fireplace. I opened the door cautiously, but there was no one there. Just the same eerie silence. But something felt different that night. The air was thick, charged with an unspoken presence. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I stayed awake, listening to the wind and the occasional rustling outside my cabin. And then, in the middle of the night, I heard it, a deep, guttural growl that sent a chill down my spine. It was coming from the forest. I knew in that instant that I wasn't alone in the wilderness. Whatever was out there was no animal I'd ever encountered. The next few days were a blur of fear and paranoia. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was stalking me. I tried to leave the cabin and venture into the surrounding woods, but every time I stepped foot outside, a sense of dread gripped me. The further I went, the more I felt like I was being drawn into something I couldn't comprehend. One morning, I found tracks in the snow. They were large, too large to belong to any animal I knew of. They appeared to be human-like, but the prints had claws, sharp and elongated. I followed them for hours, each step taking me deeper into the forest. Eventually, I came to a clearing where I saw something that will haunt me for the rest of my life. It was a figure, standing motionless under the shadow of the trees. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and its form was twisted, as if its very being defied the laws of nature. I froze, unable to move or scream. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized I was facing something that should not exist in this world. The creature seemed to sense me, turning its head slowly. Its gaze locked with mine, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as though the very essence of my being was being read, dissected. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it vanished into the shadows, leaving me standing in the clearing, trembling. I rushed back to my cabin, locking the door behind me, my mind racing. What had I seen? What was it? I couldn't explain it, and I knew that trying to would only make me sound crazy. But I wasn't crazy. I had seen something real. And it wasn't the first time. I realized then that whatever it was, it had been watching me for days, maybe even longer. The creature wasn't just a chance encounter, it was part of something much larger. That night, I heard the growls again, but they were closer, more insistent. I could feel the presence outside, surrounding me. I knew that I couldn't stay in that cabin anymore, that it wasn't safe. Whatever was out there was hunting me, and I was its prey. The next morning, I packed what little I could carry and left. I didn't even look back. As I descended the mountain, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, just out of sight, waiting. I've never gone back to the Alaskan wilderness since then. The place, the mountain, it had become something else, something not meant for human eyes. I've tried to move on, to live a normal life again, but I can't forget what I saw that day in the clearing. The creature, the growls, the eyes, sometimes when I close my eyes, I swear I can still feel its gaze on me. I know now that there are things out there, in the mountains, in the wilderness, that we are not meant to understand. I will never be the same, and I will never forget the terror that the Alaska mountains unleashed on me. The Alaska wilderness is a vast, unforgiving realm, one where few people venture unless they seek something they cannot find elsewhere. The mountains, the forests, and the icy tundra hold a profound, almost oppressive silence, broken only by the howl of the wind or the crack of ice. For most, the beauty and the isolation of the landscape are what draw them in, offering the illusion of serenity and solitude. But for others, like me, that same beauty can mask something far darker, a force beyond our comprehension. I had come to Alaska with high hopes. I wasn't just a tourist or a transient wanderer. I was seeking a new beginning, a fresh start after a life that had left me disillusioned and searching for meaning. As a forest ranger and wildlife conservationist, the mountains and forests of Alaska seemed like the perfect place to reconnect with nature and find peace. I had read the legends, heard the stories from the locals about strange occurrences in the woods, but like most people who have not experienced the wilderness for themselves, I chalked those stories up to superstition or the exaggeration of fearful minds. I had no reason to believe in anything that wasn't grounded in science and reason. The cabin I built was nestled deep within the mountains, far from the nearest town, the nearest road, or any sign of human civilization. It was the ideal location for someone looking for solitude. The air was clear, the sky forever wide and unbroken, and the wildlife, deer, moose, bears, wolves, was abundant. There was a rhythm to life in the mountains, a rhythm that grounded me and gave me the sense that I had found my place in the world. I was also a man of routine, someone who valued stability and predictability. I would spend my days tracking wildlife, mapping out the terrain, and making sure that everything in the forest was in balance. It was a life that seemed simple on the surface, but there was always a deep undercurrent of wonder beneath it all. The more time I spent there, the more I felt a strange connection to the land, as though it was pulling me deeper into its mysteries, even as I tried to ignore them. But the peace didn't last. The first sign that something was wrong came one morning when I ventured deeper into the forest, following the tracks of a wolf that had been frequenting the area. The tracks were fresh, the snow still crisp around them, and I could tell by the pattern that the wolf was alone. I had been tracking predators before, but something about this felt different. There was an unusual heaviness in the air, a sense of foreboding that hung over me like a dark cloud. As I walked further into the trees, I noticed the silence. The usual sounds of the forest, the calls of birds, the rustle of small mammals in the underbrush had ceased. In their place was an eerie stillness, as if the entire forest had held its breath. I paused, scanning the woods, trying to understand what was going on. That was when I noticed something strange, a dark shape in the distance, barely visible among the trunks of the trees. It was large, taller than any animal I had ever seen, and it moved with a fluidity that defied explanation. At first, I thought it was a bear or some other large predator, but the way it moved didn't match anything I had encountered before. It wasn't stumbling like a bear or moose might, it seemed purposeful, controlled. Its shape was hunched, but the head, if it was even a head, was too elongated and unnatural to belong to any creature I knew. I tried to dismiss it as an overactive imagination, a trick of the light, but the unsettling sensation lingered. The tracks I had been following led me deeper into the woods, and despite the overwhelming feeling of danger, I couldn't help but feel drawn to continue. It was as though something was compelling me forward, as though the land itself was trying to communicate with me. The further I went, the more intense the atmosphere became. Every snap of a branch, every whisper of wind through the leaves felt like it was meant for me, a warning or a call. I eventually stumbled upon a clearing, a place where the trees parted just enough to let a faint ray of sunlight through. In the center of the clearing lay something that I would never forget, a series of markings scratched into the earth in an intricate pattern. They were not natural, they were deliberate, as if someone or something had made them with a purpose. The markings were shaped in an arc, a semicircle that seemed to mimic the curvature of the mountains in the distance. That was when I first realized that I wasn't alone. As I stood in the clearing, my breath coming in short, panicked bursts, I heard the unmistakable crunch of snow underfoot, a sound too loud in the dead silence of the forest. I whirled around, rifle raised instinctively, but there was no one there. The forest around me felt alive in a way that was impossible to describe, a sentience that was both ancient and malevolent. The ground beneath me seemed to pulse with something that was not quite physical, a presence that had been there far longer than I had, far longer than any human had. It was then that I knew I had trespassed into something sacred, something that was not meant to be disturbed. My investigation had uncovered only the surface of what lay hidden in the wilderness. It was more than just creatures lurking in the woods. It was the very land itself, steeped in ancient power, in forces that had no place in the world of reason and logic. And what I had found wasn't just a mystery, it was a warning. As the days passed after my unsettling encounter in the clearing, the tension in the air only deepened. What I had experienced wasn't just a fleeting moment of fear or imagination. Something was alive in those woods, something ancient and primal. The markings in the ground had stayed with me, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts, and despite my training as a forest ranger, I couldn't deny that I was beginning to feel overwhelmed by forces I didn't understand. The first sign of escalation came just a few days after I'd made my discovery. I returned to the area near the clearing, determined to get more answers. I couldn't ignore what I'd seen or felt. There was something undeniable about it. I had always prided myself on being a rational man, grounded in the scientific understanding of nature. But what I was experiencing defied explanation. The air felt heavier, more oppressive. The trees, which once seemed comforting and familiar, now appeared twisted, their limbs clawing at the sky like something unnatural. The path I had taken days before now felt altered, as if the forest itself had shifted in subtle but deliberate ways. When I reached the clearing again, I found the markings had changed. They were no longer just scratches in the dirt, but now they had taken on a more ominous shape, almost like a warning or an invocation. They seemed to pulse with an eerie, almost imperceptible glow, as though the earth itself was alive with some kind of power I couldn't begin to comprehend. I tried to make sense of it, but my training as a ranger didn't prepare me for this kind of phenomenon. It wasn't something that could be rationalized with science or knowledge of natural history. I felt a deep compulsion to leave, but before I could turn back, I heard it, an unsettling sound that froze me in place. A low, guttural growl reverberating through the trees. It wasn't the kind of sound a bear or wolf would make. This was different. It was deep and resonant, like the earth itself was speaking. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I instinctively crouched, trying to become as invisible as possible in the underbrush. The growl came again, louder this time, and this time I could hear the movement of something massive, something fast, just beyond the tree line. It wasn't an animal I recognized, and it didn't move like anything I'd seen in the wilds of Alaska. The ground beneath me seemed to tremble, as if the forest itself was reacting to whatever was lurking just out of sight. My heart raced, and a sense of dread settled over me like a cold blanket. I waited, my hand clutching the rifle at my side, but nothing appeared. The growls subsided, and the forest seemed to fall into a deafening silence, the kind of silence that presses against your ears, makes it difficult to breathe. I had to leave, I knew it, but as I turned to walk back the way I came, a cold gust of wind swept through the trees, carrying with it an unbearable smell. It was a stench I couldn't place, something foul and rotten, like decay mixed with something metallic. My throat tightened, and my stomach churned. Suddenly there was movement, a flash of something in the corner of my vision. I whirled around, raising my rifle instinctively, but again there was nothing. No bear, no wolf, nothing that made sense. The forest had swallowed whatever it was back into its depths, but the feeling of being watched, hunted, was undeniable. I couldn't stay there any longer. I turned and began to move quickly through the woods, desperate to reach the safety of my cabin. But the forest was no longer a place of peace. It was a maze, a shifting labyrinth where the trees seemed to close in on me, where the path seemed unfamiliar. I knew these woods like the back of my hand, but now everything felt wrong. Every snap of a branch, every rustle in the underbrush sent my pulse spiking. I had always believed I was in control, that I understood the land better than anyone else. But now, I was lost, a stranger in my own home. I reached the cabin, but the feeling of being pursued didn't dissipate. The night was worse. I could hear something moving outside, circling the cabin, but every time I looked out the window, there was nothing. The trees were still, but the sense of something lurking in the darkness was overwhelming. Every sound, every crack of wood, every gust of wind felt like it was charged with intent. Something watching me, something aware of my every move. The next few days were a blur of mounting terror. I attempted to contact the local authorities, but my calls were met with disbelief. The area I lived in was remote, and even though I was well known in the area as a ranger, no one took my concerns seriously. I had no proof, nothing concrete. The forest could be dangerous, sure, but the supernatural? The stories of creatures in the woods, of the old legends that the locals told in hushed voices around campfires? I dismissed those too, but now I wasn't so sure. And then one night it happened. I was asleep in my cabin when I woke to the sound of something clawing at the walls, something massive, scratching and scraping at the wood like it was trying to get inside. My heart hammered in my chest, and for a moment I couldn't move. I thought it was a bear, but then I remembered something. There were no tracks around the cabin. The ground had been undisturbed. No animal, not even a bear, could move that silently. I reached for my rifle, my hands shaking, but before I could react, the window shattered, splintering into the room. Something, or someone was inside. The air turned cold, the temperature dropping so suddenly that I could see my breath. In that instant, I knew I wasn't alone anymore. The forest had sent something for me, something far more terrifying than anything I had ever encountered, something that didn't belong. In that moment, I understood the true nature of the danger I was facing. It wasn't just the wilderness that was a threat. It was something far more ancient, something tied to the very land itself. And if I didn't find a way to escape, I would become another casualty of the Alaskan wilderness. As I tried to process the overwhelming reality of what I had encountered in the forest, the situation around me grew increasingly complex. What had started as a simple mission of exploration in the Alaskan wilderness had evolved into something much darker and far more dangerous. I wasn't just facing a physical threat, but something far more insidious, something that had been lurking in the shadows of these woods long before I arrived. One subplot that began to surface as I dug deeper into the mystery was the question of whether the land itself was cursed. I had always considered myself a man of logic, a person who relied on facts, but the longer I stayed in that cabin, the more the idea of a curse gnawed at me. The forest, with its ancient trees and vast, uncharted spaces, seemed to harbor an energy I couldn't explain. In the quietest moments, I felt it in my bones, an overwhelming sense that something was watching, waiting. I began to hear stories from local residents, old-timers who had grown up in the area. They spoke of strange occurrences, missing persons, and old legends tied to the land, but their words were often brushed off as superstition. Yet, as the days went on, I couldn't ignore the growing sense that these tales were rooted in something much more real. One old man I met in town, a local trapper who had lived in the area for decades, told me of a time when he was younger, working alone deep in the wilderness. He had come across strange symbols carved into trees, marks that seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. At first, he thought it was the work of other trappers or hunters, but the more he traveled deeper into the forest, the more unsettling the occurrences became. His story mirrored mine in many ways: strange noises, unexplainable phenomena, and a growing sense of being hunted. He spoke in hushed tones, his voice full of fear, as though the mere mention of these events could summon whatever haunted the woods. He described a place deep within the forest, a place where the trees grew in unnatural formations, almost as if they had been twisted and manipulated by an unseen force. According to him, no one who ventured too far into that area ever returned the same, if they returned at all. Some even claimed they never returned at all. It sounded like the same area I had explored, but I didn't have enough evidence to confirm it yet. Another subplot that became evident as the days passed was the growing tension between me and the people I had once trusted. The local authorities and the people in the small town seemed to regard my concerns with increasing disdain. At first, I had been able to rely on them for advice and support, but as the supernatural elements of the situation began to escalate, I found myself isolated. They chalked up my experiences to stress, fatigue, or a natural response to living in such an isolated, dangerous environment. But the more I tried to explain the terror I was feeling, the more they dismissed it. I had a close friend in the local sheriff's department, a man I'd worked alongside for years. He was the one who had encouraged me to take the assignment to the remote cabin in the first place. But even he had begun to look at me with suspicion, almost as if I was losing touch with reality. It was clear that the longer I stayed in that area, the more my grip on the world I had known was slipping away. The sense of betrayal hurt, but I understood it. They were just trying to protect me, trying to shield me from what they couldn't understand. But I had already seen too much, and I knew there was no turning back. The final, and perhaps most haunting, subplot was the gradual change I began to notice in myself. As the days stretched on, I started feeling the effects of the wilderness in a way that was almost physical. The isolation, the constant stress, the sense of being pursued, it began to break me down. There were nights when I would lie awake, listening to the sounds outside my cabin, wondering if I was losing my mind. The whispers in the wind became more distinct, and the shadows in the trees seemed to move of their own accord. I began to question my own senses, wondering if the haunting sensations were the product of my fears, or if something was truly out there. One evening, as I walked the perimeter of the cabin, trying to calm my nerves, I came across something that confirmed my suspicions. There, in the dirt just outside the cabin's boundary, were fresh marks. They were unmistakable, deep scratches, almost like claw marks, too large to be from any animal I had seen in the area. But the strangest part was that they led into the woods, and then they stopped abruptly. It was as if whatever had made them had simply disappeared into thin air. This discovery led to the most difficult decision I would ever have to make. Whether I should leave the area and seek help or stay and confront whatever was hunting me. I was no longer convinced that this was simply a matter of survival. This was a fight for my very sanity. I had seen too many strange things, heard too many unsettling noises, and felt the weight of the forest bearing down on me. But I couldn't just run. I had to face it head on, even if I wasn't sure what it was. The complexities of this situation were only growing deeper, and every decision I made seemed to lead to more questions than answers. Was it the land itself that was cursed, or was there something more malevolent at work? Were the local stories mere folklore, or was there truth to the idea that ancient, forgotten forces had been disturbed by the presence of modern life? And most hauntingly, what was it that was lurking in the shadows, watching, waiting for the right moment to strike? I had no answers, but the deeper I ventured into the mystery, the more I realized that some answers might not be meant to be found. The forest had its secrets, and if I wasn't careful, I might become another one of them. The turning point came on a cold, crisp night when the boundary between the known world and the unknown became blurred beyond recognition. It had been days since I found those strange claw marks near my cabin, and each day I had spent in that isolated patch of the Alaskan wilderness had chipped away at my resolve. The eerie silence of the forest at night became unbearable, and the strange occurrences that seemed like isolated incidents before now felt like part of a larger, more sinister pattern. I had convinced myself that the danger was only psychological, that the isolation and stress were playing tricks on my mind. But the claw marks told a different story. Whatever had made them was real, and the noises that had kept me up for nights on end were not the wind or the natural sounds of the forest. I couldn't ignore it anymore. The dread in my gut was no longer something I could chalk up to fatigue or nerves. It was something tangible, something that had teeth and claws, and it was out there. The night it all changed. I had been preparing for another restless sleep when I heard a distant sound, a soft rustling at the edge of the woods, followed by a low, almost imperceptible growl. I thought I was imagining it at first. It was too subtle to be an animal. It didn't fit the usual rhythm of the forest. My instincts told me to stay inside, but my curiosity, my need for answers, overcame my fear. I grabbed my flashlight and quietly slipped out of the cabin. The beam of light swept over the dark trees, revealing nothing but shadows and shifting leaves. Yet the sensation that I wasn't alone intensified, prickling the hairs on the back of my neck. The growl came again, closer this time, followed by a dragging sound, like something large moving through the underbrush. I followed the sound through the woods, keeping my steps light and my movements slow. My heart raced in my chest as I navigated the darkness, guided only by the weak beam of the flashlight and the gnawing sense that I was being watched. Every crackling branch and whisper of wind sounded like a threat. Every movement in the shadows felt like a trap. Then I saw it. The creature was standing in the clearing ahead, its back turned to me. It was tall, towering, even, and its limbs were long and sinewy. It had an unnatural posture, as though it wasn't meant to stand upright at all. The figure was draped in tattered fur, blending seamlessly into the night, but I could see the gleam of something strange beneath it. The flickering beam of my flashlight revealed pale, glistening skin and eyes that shone a disturbing, unnatural yellow in the darkness. I froze, unsure if it had noticed me, or if it was just so absorbed in whatever it was doing that it hadn't yet turned its attention to me. My breath caught in my throat as my mind tried to process what I was seeing. This wasn't some wild animal, not a bear or a wolf. It was something far more ancient, far more dangerous. The air seemed to thicken around me, and the weight of the forest pressing down on me intensified. I could almost feel the energy shifting, the air charged with a palpable sense of hostility. The creature's head whipped around suddenly, and I felt my heart stop. Its eyes locked onto mine, and I could sense a deep, primal intelligence in them, something far beyond the instinct of a typical predator. It was as if it knew exactly what I was thinking, knew what I was about to do. I stood paralyzed, the flashlight trembling in my grip, the beam bouncing erratically as I couldn't tear my eyes away from it. The growl I had heard earlier was now a guttural snarl that seemed to vibrate through the ground beneath me. I could feel its power radiating, its presence filling the air around me. Then, as if it were a warning, it took a single step toward me, dragging its long, twisted limbs behind it. The motion was fluid but unnatural, its body rippling in ways that defied logic. It wasn't just an animal. It was something far worse, something that had been lurking in the dark corners of these woods for far too long. I wanted to run, but my feet felt rooted to the earth. I had no plan, no escape route. In that moment, the weight of the entire situation hit me. There was no logical explanation for what I was seeing, no reason for this creature to exist. It wasn't just a threat to my life, it was a threat to everything I had ever known. I wasn't just confronting a beast. I was confronting something older than time itself, something tied to the very land I had been foolish enough to venture into. The creature took another step, its movements impossibly slow, deliberate. I knew that any movement I made would signal danger. I had heard enough about predators to know that hesitation was the worst mistake you could make. But fear had paralyzed me, and I was too stunned by what I was witnessing to take any decisive action. Then out of nowhere, I heard something else, a sharp crack in the air followed by the sound of a rifle shot. The creature let out a screech, its piercing cry reverberating through the trees. It staggered back, disoriented, and in that moment, I was able to break free from my trance. My instincts kicked in, and I bolted for the cover of the trees, running as fast as I could without looking back. I didn't know who had fired the shot. All I knew was that I had narrowly escaped death, and the terror of the situation had only just begun to settle in. What had I just encountered? And why had the creature, after being shot, retreated? That moment, that confrontation with the creature, marked the turning point in my understanding of what had truly been happening in these woods. It wasn't just a matter of survival anymore. I had to find out what this creature was, where it came from, and why it had come after me. More importantly, I had to stop it from claiming more victims. But as I raced through the woods, a new realization dawned on me. I wasn't alone in this fight. There was someone else, or something else, out there watching, waiting, and I had just crossed the line into a world far more dangerous than I ever imagined. The immediate consequences of my encounter with the creature in the Alaskan wilderness were a whirlwind of fear, confusion, and disbelief. I had been a seasoned forest ranger for over a decade, and I thought I had seen it all. But nothing in my training or experience had prepared me for what I had just witnessed. The creature's unsettling presence and the chilling way it responded to my gaze made it clear. I was no longer just facing the natural dangers of the wild. I was confronted with something far beyond human understanding, a force of nature that operated on a different set of rules. After the rifle shot, I ran, panicked, breathless, and utterly terrified. I didn't know where I was running to, only that I needed to get away from the creature. The forest around me seemed to close in, shadows shifting ominously with every step. My heart pounded as I stumbled through the underbrush, adrenaline coursing through my veins. I didn't know who had fired the shot or what had happened to the creature, but I had no intention of sticking around to find out. My mind raced with questions and fears. Was the creature still alive? Had it been wounded, or was it simply biding its time? And most importantly, who else was out there shooting at it? It wasn't long before I found myself back at my cabin. I locked the door behind me, panting, my hands trembling from the fear and adrenaline. I grabbed my radio, desperate for some contact with the outside world, but the usual crackle of static filled the air. My communications were cut off, just like before, leaving me with no way to warn anyone or ask for help. The isolation of my position in the wilderness suddenly felt more suffocating than ever. I was alone, utterly alone, except for the strange forces stalking the forest outside. I spent the next several hours pacing, trying to make sense of everything. The creature I had encountered, whatever it was, seemed to defy the very laws of nature. It wasn't an animal, and it wasn't human. It was something in between, something ancient and powerful that shouldn't have existed in the first place. The sight of its glowing yellow eyes still haunted me. But beyond that terror, I knew I had a responsibility to protect the land, to protect the people who might wander too close to this dangerous place. If I didn't do something, who would? But that question brought me no answers. The more I thought about it, the more certain I became that whatever that creature was, it was part of something larger. A predator, yes, but one that had been stalking these mountains long before I had come to this remote stretch of land. I knew that I had stumbled into something far beyond my understanding, and the thought of facing it again was almost unbearable. But I had no choice. My training as a forest ranger had always been about facing danger head-on, no matter how terrifying. The idea of running away from this wasn't an option. The days that followed were filled with a sense of constant vigilance. I checked my gear, packed my supplies, and prepared for the inevitable. I knew the creature, whatever it was, wouldn't let me go so easily. I couldn't explain it, but I had the sense that it was tracking me, studying me. The growls, the strange movements in the woods, the sensation of being watched, it all pointed to one thing. It wasn't just a random encounter. The creature had singled me out for a reason. The news of the previous attacks, of the disappearances, now took on a different meaning. I had always thought of them as tragic accidents or the work of an animal. But now, in the wake of what I had experienced, I wondered if the disappearances weren't just the result of wild animals at all. What if those people had encountered the same thing I had? What if they hadn't been as fortunate? My mind was clouded with uncertainty. I tried reaching out to my colleagues, sending messages to the nearest ranger stations, but the interference in the radio signals persisted. No one was responding. I began to feel the weight of the isolation bearing down on me. This wasn't just a dangerous creature I had encountered. It was a sign of something far more sinister. I could feel it in my bones. And if I didn't act, the same fate might await me. It was in this state of heightened fear and frustration that I realized how deeply this experience had begun to affect me. I had always been a skeptic, a man who trusted in the logical, in the explainable. But now I was faced with something I couldn't explain, something that defied all reason and pushed my understanding of reality to its limits. The encounter had forced me to reconsider everything I thought I knew about the world around me, and I was no longer sure what was real. The tension in the air around me thickened as I continued to monitor the woods, waiting for the creature to return. It had to come back. It couldn't have just disappeared after the shot. But the longer I stayed there, the more I became convinced that it was only a matter of time before it did. And when it did, I wasn't sure if I would survive the encounter. Days passed, and my unease only grew. The once serene and isolated woods felt more like a death trap, a place where ancient forces roamed freely, and I was the intruder. Each rustling leaf, each snapping branch in the distance sent my heart racing. I couldn't tell if I was still in danger, or if I was simply losing my grip on reality. The fear was consuming me. It wasn't until a few nights later, when the full moon illuminated the mountains in an eerie light, that I felt the first tremor of true dread. I heard it again, the growl, low and menacing, like it was circling me, closing in. I could feel the creature's presence in the air, its gaze heavy upon me. It was out there, somewhere in the darkness, and it was waiting for me to make a mistake. In that moment, I knew one thing: my world had changed forever. I wasn't just a ranger anymore. I was a survivor, caught in a battle with something I couldn't understand. And whatever happened next, I had to be ready for it, because in this wilderness, there were no second chances. The days following the unsettling encounter with the creature were marked by an overwhelming sense of dread and confusion. I was no longer simply a forest ranger, no longer just a man living in the remote wilderness of Alaska. I had become something different, something shaped by fear, by the need for survival. The once tranquil environment I had called home now felt like a twisted labyrinth, a place where something ancient and dangerous lurked in the shadows, just out of sight. In the midst of my fear, something inside me began to shift. I had spent years working in the wild, trained to handle everything from bear encounters to harsh weather, but this was different. It was a threat beyond what I could physically face. Yet, I realized something crucial. To survive this, I had to confront my own limitations. Fear had a powerful hold over me, but if I let it consume me, I would never make it out of this alive. It wasn't just about outsmarting the creature or defending myself anymore. It was about understanding it. In those moments of terror, I began to look for patterns in its behavior. Why had it attacked? What did it want? Could it be reasoned with, or was it a mindless predator? For the first time in my life, I wasn't just trying to survive in nature. I was trying to make sense of something that didn't belong. I began to retrace my steps, revisiting the areas where I'd encountered the creature. With each journey, I took detailed notes, recording any signs or behaviors I could observe. I made sure to move cautiously, studying the environment for any evidence that could explain its existence. There was no way I could face it again if I didn't know what I was up against. This wasn't about bravado, it was about survival. And the only way to ensure that survival was to become more than just a man in the woods. This time, I had to become a student of it. The physical journey back into the heart of the wilderness was grueling. The Alaskan terrain was unforgiving, even more so now that I felt the weight of the creature's presence pressing on me at all times. Every snap of a twig, every gust of wind felt like a harbinger of doom. But the more I ventured deeper into the wilds, the more I learned. I began to notice subtle shifts in the natural environment, strange patterns in the animal life. The usual sounds of wildlife were gone. There were no birds, no small mammals scurrying around, just an eerie silence. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. In this silence, my mind wandered. I thought about the history of the area, the legends the local people spoke of, stories of creatures that shouldn't exist, entities that thrived in places where human eyes never ventured. There were whispers about things that lived in the caves and deep forests, older than the land itself. It was easy to dismiss these stories as folklore, but in my heart, I couldn't help but wonder if they had some basis in truth. The creature I had encountered, with its terrifying intelligence and unnatural speed, didn't fit the profile of any known predator. It was too elusive, too strange. What if the legends were real? What if I had stumbled upon something that had existed long before the first humans set foot in this wilderness? The more I thought about it, the more I realized that my encounter wasn't random. The creature had been watching me. Perhaps it had been for days, even weeks before we crossed paths. I wasn't just a victim in this wild place. I was an intruder in a world that had its own rules, its own order, one that I would never understand unless I confronted it head-on. I stopped thinking about survival as a series of immediate responses. I began to think about it in terms of adaptation. Survival wasn't about brute strength or a well-aimed shot. It was about learning to navigate this strange new reality. To do that, I needed to embrace the very things that terrified me, to learn from the unknown instead of running from it. I began to approach my situation from a different angle. Instead of fearing the creature, I started to look for signs of its behavior, its movements, its presence. I used my knowledge of the forest to find patterns in its hunting ground, its trails, even in the wind. This new mindset began to give me a sense of control over the situation, even when it seemed hopeless. For the first time since the encounter, I felt like I wasn't completely powerless. Then came the breakthrough. I had ventured deeper into the forest, following a trail that seemed fresher than most. As I navigated the dense trees and underbrush, I stumbled upon something I hadn't expected, a den. It wasn't a traditional animal's den, but rather a hollowed-out space in the earth, hidden beneath a layer of moss and leaves. The walls of the den were lined with strange markings, symbols etched into the wood, the stone, and the earth itself. This was no ordinary animal lair. This was something much older, something deliberately constructed. Inside, I found evidence of the creature's existence, though it was difficult to determine whether it was the work of just one being or something else altogether. The markings seemed to tell a story, cryptic symbols that suggested intelligence beyond anything I had previously encountered in the wilderness. It was as though the creature had been marking its territory, communicating in a way that defied my understanding. And then there was the most chilling part, bones. Human bones. They were arranged in a circle, as though they had been placed deliberately. The sight sent a chill through my spine, but it also provided an answer to something I had been questioning. This creature wasn't just a wild animal. It was something else, something that had been hunting and killing for far longer than I had been alive. At that moment, something within me clicked. I knew what I had to do. I could no longer act out of fear. I had to confront this creature in a way that would make sense of it, try to communicate, try to understand what it wanted. I wasn't just a survivor anymore. I was a participant in a larger story, and it was time for me to step into the role I had been avoiding. That of a protector, a defender of this wilderness, its creatures, and its secrets. I had learned to embrace the unknown. The terror that had once paralyzed me now fueled a quiet determination. If I was going to survive this, I needed to change. I needed to stop seeing myself as the hunted, and start seeing myself as part of the forest's complex web of life. A participant in an ancient struggle between predator and prey, between the seen and the unseen. It was a humbling realization, but it was also empowering. This was no longer about just surviving. It was about understanding and growing, evolving as a person, as a ranger, and as a witness to the strange and terrible forces that lay hidden beneath the surface of the Alaskan wilderness. The creature might have been a threat, but it also held a lesson. It was up to me to learn it, before it was too late. The days leading up to the climax were filled with a tense anticipation that gnawed at me. It wasn't just the fear of encountering the creature again. It was something deeper, something primal. I had learned many things about it since our first meeting, but the creature remained a mystery. Its true nature, its motives, and its origins were still unknown, even after all my careful investigation. The forest felt like it was holding its breath, too, as if it knew something was coming but didn't dare speak of it. The creature was not just an animal. It was something far more complex, something with a purpose that I couldn't yet understand. My encounters with it had been brief, each one more terrifying than the last. It moved through the shadows like an echo, its eyes glowing faintly, its movements unnaturally silent. Each time I thought I had it figured out, it slipped away, leaving me with only questions and an overwhelming sense of dread. During my research, I had stumbled across something important, a pattern. I wasn't just looking for physical signs of the creature anymore. I was looking for its behavior, its routines. It seemed to haunt specific areas, places that held particular significance. There were the old caves near the base of the mountain, the ones no one had dared enter for years. And there was a spot deep within the forest, a secluded hollow, where the trees grew unnaturally twisted, as though they had been shaped by something that wasn't quite human. It was there that the creature had left its markings, as though it were claiming dominion over the land. I had never fully understood the stories of the native people, the legends about beings that lived in the wilderness and preyed on the unsuspecting. But now, with every step I took deeper into the forest, I could feel the weight of their warnings bearing down on me. The elders had always spoken of creatures that lived between the worlds, beings that were both animal and something more, something that could slip through the cracks of reality itself. What I had once dismissed as superstition was now beginning to feel like a dire truth. My plan was simple but dangerous. I would head to the hollow, the place where the creature had left its mark. I would confront it. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about putting an end to the terror it had caused, about reclaiming the land that had once been peaceful and safe. But I knew it wouldn't be easy. I wasn't just facing an animal. I was facing something far more powerful, far more intelligent. A creature that had survived for years in the wilderness, unseen and untouchable. I had to outsmart it. I had to become something more than a ranger. I had to become a hunter. The night before I set out for the hollow, I spent hours preparing. My backpack was packed with essentials, food, water, and tools. But it was the other items that weighed heavily on my mind. The traps I had set up in the surrounding forest, the weapons I had gathered for self-defense. Each one was a potential lifeline, but each also represented a risk. What if I made the wrong move? What if I triggered the wrong trap? What if, in trying to outsmart the creature, I ended up sealing my own fate? I knew the stakes. This wasn't just about me. It wasn't just about a personal vendetta or fear. It was about the people I had sworn to protect, the families, the hikers, the hunters who ventured into this wilderness. If I failed, the creature would continue to hunt, continue to terrorize, and no one would be safe. In the days that followed, I made my way back to the hollow, my heart pounding in my chest with each step. The trees felt more oppressive than ever, their twisted branches reaching out like claws, their roots like fingers clutching at the earth. The air was thick with tension, the silence almost unbearable. I could feel its presence, just beyond the trees, watching, waiting for me to make a move. As I entered the hollow, I finally saw the full extent of the creature's influence. The trees had been warped beyond recognition, their trunks gnarled and twisted, their branches coiled like serpents. The ground was littered with the remains of animals, ripped apart, scattered across the earth as though they had been dropped carelessly. It was a graveyard, but not of the natural kind. This was something deliberate. This was the creature's work. I set up camp at the edge of the hollow, watching, waiting. I wasn't sure what I was expecting, whether it would show itself or remain hidden in the shadows, watching from afar. I had learned to be patient. The forest had taught me that much. I had spent years learning its rhythms, its cycles, but this was different. This wasn't something that followed any natural order. The wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the scent of something foul, something decayed. My instincts told me it was near. My heart raced. Every rustle of the leaves, every snap of a twig, made me jump, my hand instinctively reaching for the knife at my side. I didn't know when it would come, but I knew it was inevitable. Then there it was, a shadow moving swiftly through the trees. It was the creature, larger than I had imagined, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. The air around it seemed to shift, as though reality itself were bending in its presence. It was as if the forest itself were holding its breath, waiting for what would happen next. I knew this was it. This was the moment I had been preparing for. I had no more time to question my choices, no more time to doubt myself. This was my only chance to face the creature, to end its reign of terror and restore some sense of peace to the wilderness I had once loved. The fight would be brutal, and I would need every ounce of strength and wit to survive. There was no going back now. The creature had seen me, and it would not stop until it had me. But I was ready, or at least I thought I was. The final battle was about to begin. The air was thick with tension as I stared into the dark, shifting silhouette of the creature, its glowing eyes piercing through the shadows like twin embers in the night. The hollow around me seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, the trees whispering, the wind howling as if they too were waiting for the inevitable clash. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up, a cold shiver running down my spine. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to turn and run, but I couldn't. Not this time. I had come too far to back down now. I gripped the knife tightly in my hand, the steel cold against my palm. My other hand held a flare gun, the light of which could illuminate the darkness and perhaps give me a split-second advantage if the creature came at me full force. The creature's eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment, there was an eerie silence between us, as if it were studying me, assessing my every move. It was intelligent, too intelligent, and I realized then that I was not facing an animal, but something far worse, something that could think, plan, and adapt. A low growl rumbled from deep within its chest, the sound vibrating through the earth beneath me. My heart pounded, but I didn't flinch. I couldn't. I had spent too many years studying the wilderness to be caught off guard now. I had prepared for this moment my whole life, but deep down, a voice in my mind whispered the truth. Nothing had prepared me for this. With a speed that took me by surprise, the creature lunged, its massive body crashing through the underbrush. It was as though the very earth had shifted under its weight. In one smooth motion, I fired the flare gun into the air, the bright burst of light temporarily blinding me as it arced high above us. The creature screeched a horrid, inhuman sound and staggered back, shielding its eyes from the blinding light. I didn't waste a second. I moved quickly, sprinting toward the nearby ridge, the flare gun still hot in my hand. The creature, enraged by the light, was recovering, but it was disoriented, confused. That was my chance. The shadows between us grew thicker, and I could feel the sweat pooling on my skin, my breath coming in short bursts. I climbed the ridge, using every ounce of muscle I had to haul myself up, the creature's eyes following my every move. It was relentless, and I could hear it following me, its claws tearing through the foliage with a deafening noise. I reached the top of the ridge and paused, knowing the creature was closing in. The forest had grown eerily silent once again, as though the earth was holding its breath. I could hear its low growl echoing through the trees, but I couldn't see it. My eyes scanned the shadows, looking for any sign of movement. My hands gripped the knife, knuckles white, but my mind was clear. I had one shot at this, one chance to take control. Suddenly I heard it, a rustling in the undergrowth to my left. My body tensed, but I didn't move. The creature was close, too close. Then, without warning, it sprang from the shadows, its claws slashing through the air, its mouth open wide, teeth bared like knives. I barely had time to react. I swung the knife, just grazing its side as it veered to the side, avoiding my strike with an unnatural speed. The creature's eyes flashed, its skin an eerie shade of gray, almost translucent, as if it were not entirely of this world. It growled low again, its body shifting, twisting as if the bones beneath its flesh were constantly rearranging themselves. It was the stuff of nightmares, something beyond human comprehension. I could feel the ground beneath my feet begin to give way. The ridge was unstable, the rocks crumbling under the weight of our battle. With a roar, the creature lunged once more, its claws swiping in an arc. I dodged, but it caught my leg, raking deep gouges into my flesh. Pain shot up my leg, but I pushed through it, forcing myself to stay focused. I couldn't let it win. Not now. I reached into my pack, my fingers trembling as I grabbed the makeshift grenade I had prepared earlier. It was crude but effective. With one swift motion, I pulled the pin and threw it at the creature, the explosive device landing just in front of it. It exploded in a blinding flash of light and noise, sending the creature tumbling backward, its screech reverberating through the forest. For a moment, everything went silent. The smoke from the blast hung in the air, swirling like a fog. My heart was pounding in my chest, my leg burning with pain, but I didn't have time to think about it. I had to finish this. As the smoke cleared, I saw the creature lying on the ground, its body twisted in unnatural angles. For a brief second, I thought I had done it, but then I saw it move. Slowly, painfully, it rose to its feet. It was not finished. It was never finished. With a final, desperate surge of adrenaline, I rushed forward, the pain in my leg nearly unbearable as I drove the knife deep into its chest, right where its heart should have been. The creature let out one last scream, its eyes locking onto mine in a final moment of recognition. Then it collapsed, its body going limp as the life drained from it. I stood there, panting, bloodied, my heart racing in my chest. It was over. The creature was dead. The forest around me was still, the sounds of nature returning, as if nothing had ever happened. But I knew better. The world had just changed. and I had survived to see it. As I stood over the lifeless body of the creature, I couldn't help but feel a strange mix of relief and disbelief. The battle was over, but the weight of what had just transpired still hung heavily in the air. I had come to the mountains of Alaska as a protector of the wild, a man who thought he understood the forces that shaped this land. Yet, nothing had prepared me for what I had faced in those dark woods. The creature wasn't a bear, or any other animal I had studied. It was something else, something far older, far more dangerous, and far more intelligent than I could have imagined. I wiped the sweat and blood from my brow, my body aching from the fight, my leg throbbing with every step. The reality of what I had just done began to sink in. I had killed something that wasn't supposed to exist. And in doing so, I had uncovered a dark truth that would forever change my perception of the world. But as the adrenaline wore off and the forest around me seemed to settle back into its eerie calm, a deep sense of sadness crept in. The creature I had killed wasn't just a mindless monster. It was a living being, caught in some cycle of violence that had likely lasted for centuries. In the end, I had been forced to end its existence, just as I had been forced to confront the monstrous forces lurking in the hidden corners of the world. But I didn't feel like a hero. I felt like a man who had been pushed to the edge of his understanding, forced to kill in order to survive. The bloodstains on my hands were a constant reminder of the cost of that survival. As I began the long walk back to my camp, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had only uncovered the tip of the iceberg. What else was out there, hidden in the mountains and forests I had sworn to protect? What other creatures, beasts, spirits, or even something more, were lurking just beyond the veil of our understanding? I had seen the darkness firsthand, and I knew now that it wasn't just a story, a myth, or a legend. It was real, and there were forces at work that went far beyond what the average person could comprehend. What I had witnessed was not an isolated event, but part of something larger, something far more dangerous. As I made my way back through the dense forest, every shadow seemed to hide something sinister. Every rustle in the leaves sent a chill down my spine. Was I being followed? Had I truly killed the only one of its kind? Or was there more out there, waiting, watching, preparing for the next move? I didn't know, and I wasn't sure I wanted to know. But what I did know, without a doubt, was that I could never be the same again. The world I had known, the one I thought I understood as a protector of nature, had changed forever. The truth about what existed in the shadows, what thrived beyond the realms of human understanding, had been revealed to me in its most terrifying form. I had been changed, not just as a man, but as a witness to the unknown. And that was a burden I would carry for the rest of my life. Years have passed since that day in the Alaskan wilderness, but the memory still haunts me. I've returned to a quieter life, far from the mountains, yet the shadows of what I encountered linger. I never spoke of the creature to anyone. What would they believe? What words could convey the terror of facing something so alien, so primal? But deep in the forest, I know it's still there waiting, hidden from the world. Sometimes, when the wind howls through the trees, I wonder if the cycle will repeat, and if one day it will find me again. If you've ever felt the pull of the unknown, the whisper of something lurking in the shadows, or the chill of an unexplained presence, you're not alone. The world is full of mysteries, hidden beneath layers of history and folklore. I've faced these horrors, and now it's your turn to explore them. Do you have the courage to uncover the secrets of the wild, or will you, like many before, turn away when the truth is too terrifying to confront? Stay alert, for the wilderness is not as empty as it seems. The unknown is always watching.